I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Meredith Drosbeck. She is the Deputy Director of Science at Sciline. She'll tell you a little bit more about that. Part of what she does is she teaches scientists to communicate science to a general audience, especially through the media. So thank you. We're so honored to have her to give us this overview of how to work with media as we all count down to E-Day.
Thank you all. Thank you to the organizers so much for having me. As she said, my name is Meredith Drosbeck, and I am the Deputy Director for Science at Sciline. Sciline is a program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAS. And our entire mission is to work with scientists and reporters to support the production of evidence-based, scientifically accurate news stories. We do that in a variety of ways through free services that we offer to both communities, but it's really about connecting science, scientists, and reporters. It's fundamental to everything that we do. What I'm going to talk with you today about is working with media. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of today's media landscape and the types of media outlets and platforms you might encounter. I'll also give you some recommendations of what to think about when you're considering whether to accept an interview request, a few tips for what to do during and after the interview itself, and I'll close with some advice on how to make sure reporters can actually find you when they're looking for a source with your expertise. And if I've timed myself right, there'll also be some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to try this magic advancer and see which direction is forward. There we go. The last decade has brought significant changes to the media landscape. In 2008, roughly 114,000 people worked in US newsrooms. That's not only reporters, but editors, photographers, videographers, producers, everything it takes to produce and release the news. By 2020, that number had dropped to 85,000, a loss of nearly 1/4. This includes staff from newspapers, radio and television, from cable news and digital platforms. There are a lot of complicating factors driving that trend, but the big one is revenue loss from the shift from print to digital platforms. This bar chart shows the percentage of total newsroom employees by sector at 3 points in time. On the left is 2008, in the middle, 2014, and on the right, 2020. In that 12-year span, newsroom employment has plummeted at newspapers, shown in the dark brown at the bottom of each bar, while it's increased in the digital publishing sector, as you might expect, the tan at the top. Newspapers, again, the dark brown at the bottom, which once employed 62% of all news professionals in 2008, now only account for 36%. Broadcast TV, the maroon in the middle, has actually increased its share of news employees, but in raw numbers, their employment has basically stayed the same. By maintaining that employment as numbers dropped overall, TV now reflects a higher percentage of the population. Digital publishing, as you might guess, is really the only domain in which the raw numbers of jobs have noticeably increased in this time span. But even though news staffs are shrinking, that doesn't mean there's less news to report or that news is happening more slowly. Instead, in many places, fewer reporters are trying to cover just as much news, only faster. And the result, in particular for science news, whether it's news about science or topics for which science could be informative, may not be reported by journalists with a particular background in that field. Those types of specialized reporters were among the first rounds of layoffs in this overall decreasing trend for newsroom employment. So those science stories, when they are reported at all, are often handled by what are called general assignment reporters. These are reporters without a particular specialty who report on everything that they're assigned, from human interest to crime to politics to breaking news. And they are often truly excellent journalists. But at the same time, they may not have a deep background in science or other technical issues. They don't understand necessarily how the nuance of science works or have a broad network of experts to whom they can turn. So if you all are thinking about starting to work with media, or even maintaining or expanding the media engagement that you already do, I hope you can understand from this that you're crossing paths with an industry that can be incredibly helped by your expertise. There are three primary types of media outlets you are likely to encounter, and the specific needs of reporters vary by type. National publications like the New York Times, Fox News, or NPR have very broad audience and very broad scope. They're often some of the most well-funded newsrooms, and they're probably the most likely to have a dedicated science or health or environment reporter that is covering those issues. They may even specifically have a science section of their coverage. Because their audience is national, they often focus on generalizable knowledge that's going to be relevant to a large portion of the country, from coast to coast, things that a significant fraction of people may find interesting and useful. National reporters also look for sources from different parts of the country. They're not tied to a particular institution or community. In contrast, local news focuses on local issues and applications. It's the proverbial news you can use. These are the newspapers, radio, and television stations that focus on reporting about local people, local places, and issues within a defined geographic region, like the Bismarck Tribune in North Dakota or St. Louis Public Radio. These local outlets are the ones who have been among the hardest hit by layoffs and funding cuts over the last decade. And some local news outlets, especially newspapers, have closed altogether in that time. And when science, health, or environment reporting does happen at these outlets, as I mentioned earlier, it's likely to be handled by a general assignment reporter who doesn't have specialized training or experience in that particular topic. So the sources they speak with are particularly important for providing context and information that that reporter needs to get the story right. For local media, they often also prefer local sources. They will turn to local research institutions or universities, community partners looking for an expert to speak with for their stories. And what they ask about might not be only the science or other technical issues, but how it's relevant to the community, the people in that community. They really want to tailor it for that particular audience. Finally, there are specialty outlets. These are publications that focus on a particular topic. Sometimes that topic is broad, or what we would consider broad, like science. Sometimes it's more specific, like climate or energy or health. The audience for these publications is narrower and typically has a higher level of understanding of that particular topic than the general public might. So the publication would typically allow more technical context and content than, for example, a local newspaper would in the stories they publish. Each of these different types of outlets also exist on different platforms. So you need to consider whether the story you might be interviewed for will appear in print, radio, or television. The most common interview you are likely to do with a reporter is for a story in print. These days, that can mean a newspaper or purely digital content. In either case, the audience will read the article, not listen or watch it. Print interviews are often the longest as well. As a source, you'll have the most flexibility in what you say and how you say it, because a print reporter can isolate short phrases or even single words to quote that will fit into the contextual language of a paragraph that they're drafting. Your verbal tics, your ums, your uhs, those are also not going to show up in print. But tone, such as sarcasm or sometimes humor, wow, that just got loud, can be lost when transitioning from spoken conversation to text. So be really careful about if you choose to use humor or sarcasm when speaking with a print reporter. On the radio, also podcasts, the situation is a little different. Radio interviews can be live or they can be taped. And if they're taped, they may be edited, but they don't have to be. Because it's audio, that means your ums and your uhs will be heard if they're in the middle of a sentence that's used. They can't clip out a word or a short phrase to integrate into a story in the same way that a print reporter could. Your tone and your level of enthusiasm is going to come across as well. If you sound like you're bored, if you sound like you're unsure of yourself, that is going to be noticeable not only to the reporter, but potentially to the audience if they choose to use that. And when radio is live, there are no do-overs. If it's a taped interview, you can always ask if you can start an answer again and try over. The reporter's under no obligation to ignore that first take, but they also are going to be looking for the best clip possible to integrate into their stories. They're not out to embarrass you, to make you look bad or get you in any way. So it's usually a more collaborative opportunity if it's a taped interview to say, you know what, I didn't like that answer. Can I try that again and make it smoother? And that's often okay. Finally, there's television. Like radio, complete thoughts and sentences matter. They're not going to clip out a single word and pop you on the television for half a second. So does enthusiasm. And this time, it's not just in your voice, but in your body language as well. Experts used to appear in studio for television a lot, or have reporters come to their office or come to their lab. These days, a lot of these interviews are taking place by Zoom or Skype. But the same principle generally holds. Make sure that you are in a comfortable position that you can hold for the duration of that interview. Don't precariously perch yourself on the side of a chair because you think it looks good and 30 minutes later you're about to fall over. Make sure you're well lit and make sure you're centered in the frame. And finally, make sure there's enough space below you in the frame so that the station can put your name and your title and the chyron, and it's not like up under your chin in some way. A producer is likely to help you with all of these details, but it's always good to have a sense of those requirements when you're choosing where you'll be for the interview before you actually turn your camera on. On TV, you'll also want to keep your fidgeting to a minimum. Lots of us have sort of physical versions of a verbal tic. You can probably tell I am desperately trying not to walk around right now as I speak. Other people may bounce their leg or play with their hair or touch their face. Start to be aware of those habits. Pay attention to yourself if you are thinking about working with television media so that you can know what habits you have and start to pull those back a bit if you think it's going to be distracting on camera. So we've talked about the matrix of different outlets and different platforms. What about the reporters themselves? At a high level, journalists and scientists have a lot in common. Curiosity drives a lot of what reporters choose to cover in a similar way that it drives the research you choose to pursue if you're a scientist. Both groups are also measured by what they publish. Publish or perish is a true statement. It's the old rule in academia, and in many ways that's true for reporters as well. It's just that they often have to publish every day, depending on the outlet for which they work. Also, both groups want to be first. Nobody wants to be scooped, whether it's on a scientific discovery or on a big story. But that does not mean that there's 100% overlap in your goals. And some of those differences are things you should keep in mind as you prepare for and practice for an interview. There are a couple of these that I want to highlight. The first is that journalists typically publish on dramatically different timescales from researchers. It can be daily. Some have multiple daily deadlines. So when you get a call from a reporter and they say they need to talk to somebody in the next few hours, they're usually being honest about that. If a reporter does reach out to ask for an interview on short notice, a quick response from you, even if just say, sorry, I can't do it this time, can be so valuable. You'll be remembered as being responsive, even if you couldn't do the interview, and they'll probably be more likely to come back to you another time and try again. I also wanted to mention the dichotomy of preparedness versus unscripted remarks. What you would hear from me in a longer science communication training, and really from any science communication practitioner, is that you should have 2 to 3 main points you want to make when you go into that interview. Right? This is a conversation between you and a reporter. You should have a purpose and you should have goals in the same way that the reporter is coming into that conversation with a purpose and goals. And you should definitely practice what you want to say. But journalists don't necessarily want to be read a script. And so they'll strive to put you at ease, to try to capture something that doesn't sound quite as rehearsed. That's not a bad thing, and it's not insincere. Reporters are genuinely friendly and inquisitive people. But you should be aware of that as an approach and a tactic, and be conscious of how you respond. If you do wind up discussing something you didn't plan for, make sure it's because you decide to go down that route, not because you started rambling and let things get away from you and suddenly you're talking about a personal story you hadn't intended to share with a reporter. So let's say that there is breaking news or a big celestial event related to your area of expertise, and a reporter has reached out to ask for an interview. What should you do? Your first step should be to reply to the reporter quickly. As I mentioned earlier, they're often working on publishing a story each day, sometimes more than one, and that really does mean that their deadlines are short. It's not uncommon to get a request for an interview in the next couple of hours. It's not because they procrastinated or because they think their work is more important than your time. It's more likely they just got the assignment and have only a few hours to report and produce that story. And they're reaching out to help because they're reaching out for help because they want their story to be accurate and informative to their readers, their viewers, or their listeners. If you know you're not available or simply don't want to do the interview, again, replying with a quick no thank you allows the reporter to cross you off your list and move on. You're not leaving them in limbo in that way. But let's say you do want to consider it. There's some critical questions to ask that make sure you have all the information you need to make an informed decision. First, if they haven't given you much detail, ask what the story is about. You can even ask them to share some of their intended questions with you in advance to give you a sense of what they want to know. Although not all reporters will do this, both because it takes extra time on their part and sometimes results in responses that again sound too scripted, but you can always ask. You should also ask about the outlet if you're not familiar with it already. Is it a local TV station across the country, or maybe an exclusively online specialty magazine that they're working for? You can ask about the outlet's audience too. Is the story intended for a science-savvy reader or the general public? This will allow you to prepare your potential talking points at the appropriate level for the audience that the reporter is aiming for. Ask what the reporter's deadline is. If you've got a few days, that's actually pretty leisurely. It may be mere hours, though you can always ask for flexibility. A reporter may want to complete all of their interviews that day before lunch, but maybe they could squeeze you in a little later in the afternoon if needed, giving you more time to prepare, and therefore potentially having a better interview in the end. And finally, ask if the interview will be by phone, email, or video. Lots of interviews these days are on Zoom, even if video is not actually used in the published story. If the story is for radio or TV broadcast, it's important to know if it will be recorded or airing live. Because again, if it's recorded, it could be edited, which would give you the opportunity to potentially redo an answer if you need to, or clarify something. Those options aren't available if it's live. You can handle either situation, but you need to know what it is going in. So with that info in hand, you now have a better idea of what's being asked of you. And you can consider how well this opportunity fits into your own media engagement interests. What audiences do you want to reach? And how do you want to reach them? Remember that national news outlets, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, have large, broad audiences, and they aim to contextualize science in societal terms. Local news, like your local NPR affiliate or your town's newspaper, are generally highly trusted sources in the community. They reflect the interests and needs of that community, and they prioritize information that's directly relevant to that geographic region. Especially if you're getting a lot of requests due to breaking news, or you're unsure how to decide among competing interview opportunities, I encourage you to think about how well a given request meets your personal and professional priorities. Your university's press officers can also help you understand and weigh your options. And I'll talk a little bit about press officers toward the end. Once you've decided whether to do the interview, let the reporter know as soon as you can. Remember that even if you decline, a brief and friendly response helps them to move on and can leave the door open for future opportunities. If you do decline, consider referring a colleague whose expertise might also be a good fit for the reporter's needs. They really, even I, when I'm doing this, really appreciate those referrals and references from a trusted source that I know. Of course, it's always polite to contact the person you have in mind and let them know that you've passed their information on to a reporter. But keep in mind that your colleagues can also be valuable assets for reporters. So let's say you have asked all of your questions, you have considered your options, and you decided, yes, you are going to do this interview. The final piece of the puzzle you need to clarify with a reporter is attribution. How can they use what you say? The default for an interview is that every word you say is on the record, which means that it can be quoted and attributed to you by name. Any other scenario must be agreed upon ahead of time. This is particularly important because different reporters or outlets might define terms differently. So you want to make sure you know exactly what you're agreeing to before you and the reporter begin an interview. Generally speaking, off the record means that what you say cannot be used by the reporter in any way. But again, this must be agreed to ahead of time. Despite what television might tell you, you can't just say, oh, this is off the record in the middle of an interview and continue talking. That is actually not off the record. You have to agree to that, and you have to get the agreement from the reporter. On background usually means that a reporter can use what you say, but not as a direct quote or attributed to you. It might be context or general information that could help frame a story and might end up paraphrased or attributed to an individual with a generic title. This is often the scenario in which you see senior officials quoted in a story. That's typically on background. But there's a lot of ambiguity here, and different reporters may interpret the term differently. So always be clear and confirm the rules for attribution for each interview that you do. And finally, I recommend that you don't try going on and off the record a bunch mid-interview if you don't want to talk about a specific topic. Even if you get that agreement, it can be confusing for both you and the reporter to be on the record, off the record, on and off. Instead, if you don't want to be quoted on a topic, simply say, you're not prepared to talk about that subject and leave it at that. Sometimes a reporter will ask a question that you can't or don't want to answer. It might be something about your personal opinion on a controversial issue, like a question facing your local county school board, or comments on an event with which you are not familiar. Situations like these can be very uncomfortable, but there are graceful ways to handle them. A reliable technique for handling difficult questions is to pivot your response away from the potentially thorny issue or thorny question that the reporter has posed that you really don't want to deal with toward a more comfortable topic that you do want to discuss and you do feel capable of commenting on. The typical approach for pivoting is to acknowledge what the reporter has said, which is not the same as agreeing with it, it's acknowledging it. Then use a transition phrase or sentence to redirect or pivot toward a point that you want to make. For a pivot to work without seeming really suspicious, it has to sound authentic to you. You can't have an expression of uncertainty or abject panic on your face, and you can't sound manipulative either. That's really going to destroy the relationship that you're building with the reporter right there. Pivots are most effective if they are simple, if they are direct, and they flow naturally in conversation. But the truth is, this is not actually a natural response. Most of us are pretty well conditioned to answer a question when it's asked. Obfuscating, getting around it just is not our first inclination. And an interview isn't exactly a normal everyday conversation. It can feel that way. It can be very conversational, like you're chatting with a friend, but is a professional conversation with a purpose. So you want to practice pivots until they become an easier tool for you. This is one of those times where it's really helpful to have a friend or a colleague who can just lob difficult questions at you, so you can get used to reacting to it. You get used to that awkward feeling of pivoting so that in a real interview, you won't hesitate, or worry that you're going to stumble. There are lots of pivoting phrases you can use. In many of these cases, you can see there's an explicit acknowledgement of the question, but they don't necessarily suggest that you agree with the question as posed. And then you change the direction, setting up the point that you want to make. For example, in this first bullet, it starts with, I understand what you were asking. This simply recognizes that a question has been asked. It is a thing that happened. But from there, you can lead the reporter to what you actually want to say. In this case, by literally saying what you think is more important than the original question as posed. And while every pivot runs the risk of highlighting your discomfort with a question, a pivot that stays on the same general topic is much more likely to be accepted by your interviewer and get you past that difficult question. In fact, research suggests that pivoting to a topic at least related to the one that you want to sidestep can help you maintain the trust of your audience, in this case, the reporter, even as you are avoiding directly answering that question. So you want to redirect to a similar topic, but it also has to be one that you are well-versed in, because you are taking control here and deliberately changing the focus of the conversation, even if it's just obliquely. So make sure it's toward a strong talking point for you. There are a few common types of questions you could encounter in which you might want to use a pivot. I want to highlight just a few of these. Sometimes a reporter might pose a what if or a hypothetical question. I imagine political scientists around the country are bracing themselves for the inevitable, will President Biden be reelected in 2024? One could simply respond by saying, I don't want to speculate, acknowledging the question, and then pivot, perhaps with a, but what matters most to upholding our democracy is, and then go into talking about that. Another common type of question where pivots work well is the false dilemma. This might come up in terms of a question that asks, which is more important, option A or option B? For example, is it more important to wear a mask to prevent the spread of COVID or to wash your hands after coughing and sneezing? The reality is, in most cases, yes, both is the actual answer. It's not an either or. So in this example, a physician might say, I wouldn't frame the question that way, since both actions have benefits, and then go on to discuss how they can work in tandem. You could also, on rare occasions, encounter a question that's just so off topic or just out of the blue that you don't want to give any answer and move off it as quickly as possible. In this case, you could try something non-committal like perhaps, but the important point I want to make is, and move into that. The one thing you should avoid saying is no comment. That's sometimes interpreted to be a comment, and occasionally you'll see that it's reported as such. And it often is interpreted by the public as something you're trying to hide. So I would avoid saying no comment to the extent possible. There's also a finer, soft use of a pivot that I want to mention here. A common interview technique for a reporter trying to get a quotable comment is not only to ask the question, but to suggest a potential answer. For example, instead of going with an open-ended, how did you feel when you saw the results of your experiment? They might instead say, were you amazed by those results? Or even more assertively, you must have been amazed. Questions or assertions like this often elicit an almost automatic yes agreement to it, if you don't stop and think. And if I did say yes, the reporter could legitimately write, Dr. Drosbeck said she was amazed by this finding. But if I had taken a moment to think, it might have been more honest to say, I was delighted to see the robust findings emerge from the data after all of this time, but I wasn't amazed by the results, and here's why. You never have to agree with or echo the reporter's words. It's far better to think for a moment and use your own words. You may still find yourself reflecting the tone that was suggested to you, but you've pivoted to your own preferred language, your own voice. So it's a really soft shift, but it is one that helps make sure your answer is true to you. One last word on pivoting. This skill is really important to have in your back pocket if you're going to do a lot of media interviews. But going into an interview predisposed to be cagey will not serve your or the reporter's interests. If you must pivot, do it sparingly and do it collegially, recognizing that you and the reporter each have a job to do. Even if there's some differences in your approach, you can still have a conversation, a very productive conversation that reflects your shared desire to inform the public. Remember that you and the reporter share many of the same goals in an interview. You have information, you have context, and you have insight that you want to share. And the reporter hopes to tell an informative, contextual, and insightful story. So even if there are one or two difficult questions, you really can collaborate and do this together. Once you've reached the end of your interview, you've given some great context, some pithy quotes, you have skillfully navigated that one pesky question you didn't want to answer, it's time to wrap up. One of the best things you can do at the end of an interview is to ask the reporter to summarize the most important things they heard from you. This is your opportunity to correct any misunderstandings they might have right on the spot and before you leave, and to make sure that they captured those main points that you wanted to get across in that interview. Many reporters will often ask at the end if there's anything you want to add or anything they didn't ask you. And you should always have something prepared for this. It could be to reiterate one of those main points. It could be to answer the one question you were really hoping to get and you didn't. It could even be something more personal, like to highlight relevant research you were about to publish on the topic you've been discussing with an offer to follow up when that research is available. Although keep in mind, you are still on the record, so a reporter could talk about that in their story. Don't scoop yourself, but it's an option if you want to put it out there. Responding to this question of what else you want to add by saying, oh, I've got nothing else to say, is such a missed opportunity for you as a source. Always be prepared for this question and use it to your advantage. Finally, if you are willing, you can offer to be available for follow-up or any fact checks that the reporter might want to do. And now your interview is complete and you wait. Because at this point, your part in the process, your role in the story is out of your hands. And as a source, this is the hard part, because it's now up to the reporter to take what you and other sources have shared with them and synthesize it all into a coherent story. So what do you do while you wait? Lots of researchers, scientists, really any source, want to see the story before it's published, to give their stamp of approval or make changes before it goes out into the world. But most reporters, especially here in the United States, will say no to this request. This is because most interpretations of journalistic ethics prohibit a reporter from getting approval from a source before a story is published. And while that can be frustrating on science stories, it makes a lot more sense when you think about other types of stories. If a journalist is reporting on a politician's fictitious statements, you don't want that reporter to have to get approval from the politician before their story runs. So the same rule holds for journalism across the board. As a source, it's generally not great form to ask to see the story ahead of time. And if you do ask, it's highly unlikely that you will get to. But an alternative is to ask for a fact check or a quote check. There's still no guarantee, but it's a gentler ask. And if the reporter agrees, it could give you the opportunity to at least confirm specific facts or direct quotes that you provided are accurate. You wouldn't see the whole story, and you may not even see the actual wording of the fact itself, but the scenario allows them to check in with you for general accuracy. So you can always ask for that. You could make that offer, see what happens, but you're not going to get to see the story for the most part. The vast majority of the time, when the story is published, it turns out great. Your quotes are clear, they are direct, they provide important context and color to a really well done story. Job well done on all sides. Every so often, though, mistakes do happen in the final product. So what can you do? If a story is published and something is inaccurate, you can and you should reach out to the reporter and ask for a correction. Reporters really want to be accurate as well. They want to know if something is wrong. But keep in mind, the strategy is only for when something is factually wrong. Wishing that they had chosen a better quote or not emphasizing what you think is the most important thing, those aren't appropriate situations to request a correction. And you're very unlikely to get one if you do. But if the facts themselves are wrong, this is when you can typically get fixed. Because remember, they want to get the story right as much as you want to see it right. Finally, if you've heard all of this and you are ready to dive in to talking with reporters, here's some advice for how to set yourself up to get that call. The starting point for being findable in general is to have a web page and keep it updated. This is critical if you want to be found by reporters who are doing a Google search for that topic, as well as for any journalists who might want to learn more specifics about you after they've discovered you another way. We often think of our professional web pages as opportunities to reach potential students or collaborators or our colleagues, and we set our web pages up with those kinds of audiences in mind. But the language needs to be a little bit different if you want to pique the interest of reporters. You want to make part of your description of your professional expertise easily accessible and understood by non-scientists, not just scientists outside your field, but non-scientists. Think about even using a bulleted list of non-jargon keywords that describe your work and your expertise. So at a glance, someone can tell what your areas of expertise are and if they're relevant to what they're looking for. If public engagement and communication is something that is important to you, make that clear as well. Consider having a tab on your website that lists your media appearances. It signals to the reporter that you value working with media, and you may be especially open to a cold email request for an interview. A good way to connect with local or regional reporters is to connect with your home institution's public information officers, or PIOs. These people may also be called communication officers or media relations specialists at your institution. They go by a variety of names. Their role is typically to handle media relations for a university or college within that university or at the institute level. Part of a PIO's day-to-day job is to field requests from reporters who are looking for someone to interview on a specific topic. So make sure that your PIO knows that you are interested in speaking with the media and what topics you're comfortable speaking about. That way, you will be top of mind for them when they get a relevant request from a reporter and they can make that connection. But the role of a PIO doesn't stop there. You may also want to tell them when you have something newsworthy to say. Maybe you have a journal article coming out, or you're speaking at a high profile event, or you have a big plan for what you're going to do around an upcoming eclipse, something along these lines. Your communications office may be interested in putting together a press release with you, or reaching out directly to a local reporter that they know has an interest in your topic. But if they don't know what you're up to, they can't market you. Keep in mind, it can take some time to put together a press release, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. So you have to settle on text, get some photos and images, fully clear it through everybody who has to see the press release. So don't wait until the day before your article is published to go to your PIO and loop them in. If you do find yourself featured in a press release, try to coordinate your calendar so that you can be reasonably responsive to the inquiries that result. Issuing a press release the day before a 2-week observing run isn't going to be conducive to lining up a bunch of interviews. You can also make sure your name appears on expert lists. There are a bunch of these. Lots of universities and departments have expert lists for media. Some are discipline specific or run by specialized scientific societies. I know APS and AGU have had these in the past. Some are demographic specific, like 500 women scientists or 500 queer scientists. And a personal plug, you can always sign up for Sciline by filling out a short form on our website at sciline.org. We keep our database of scientists private. Reporters cannot search it. But when reporters come to us looking for a source, that database is where we turn to look for people we think might be a good fit for those reporters' needs. So I encourage you to check us out as well. As part of a reporter's search process, they'll often look at what other stories are out there on the topic they're covering. and they may reach out to experts quoted in those stories. It can seem kind of daunting to break into a self-reinforcing cycle like that, but there are other ways that you can wind up on the same radar. You can write an op-ed for your local paper. You could write some blogs for a university website, or even a story for The Conversation. How many of you guys have heard of The Conversation? Out of curiosity. I see 2 hands, 3 hands. The Conversation publishes pieces written by academics that are edited by journalists. And those pieces actually often get picked up and distributed pretty widely in news outlets. So beyond their immediate impact, reporters do notice who writes those pieces, and it could make you a good candidate in time for them to contact in the future. And of course, we have to talk about social media, particularly the platform formerly known as Twitter. It can be a great place to engage in conversation, to share your expertise, hear from a wide variety of people with different backgrounds. It can also spiral wildly out of control in ways in which you never predicted. The single most important piece of advice I can give you on social media is if you choose to engage, be deliberate and be thoughtful about how you do it. Be honest, but not flippant, and be as open as you're willing to be with the understanding that the whole world may see what you say. We've seen an increasing number of reporters who use tweets directly in their reporting, especially for stories online. Remember that anything you say or write on social media is public and therefore on the record. So start by assuming that any post, any tweet, or any shared item may show up on the front page of the New York Times next to your name, and go from there. On a less intimidating note, social media can be a great place to engage with reporters directly. Lots of reporters are very active there. They are watching what's happening on their beat. They're looking for story ideas. If you pay attention, especially with local reporters, you'll often see them openly soliciting ideas or recommendations for sources on a topic. They are looking for people to talk with. So follow the reporters that you like, especially local reporters, and learn about what they cover and what interests them. When they ask questions, they do genuinely want to hear from their audience. So if you have something to say, and it's an area in which you think you have some genuine knowledge and insight, go ahead and answer. Be a part of the conversation and contribute thoughtfully, and over time, making a positive impression can evolve to becoming a source to whom a reporter can turn directly. And finally, maintaining relationships that you build is incredibly important. As you've heard me say multiple times this morning, reporters are often under intense pressure to get something produced both quickly and accurately. And when they're under that kind of pressure, as anybody would be, they are more likely to turn to trusted sources who they know will be responsive, knowledgeable, and fair-minded. One way to initiate a relationship is simply to reach out to a reporter directly. If you see a story that you liked or is about a topic in which you have expertise, you can send an email to the reporter, introduce yourself, let them know what you liked about the story that they wrote. Everybody likes to be told how great they are, right? You're going to start off on the right foot there. Offer to be a resource if they continue to cover that topic in the future. And remember that relationships go both ways. If you want a reporter to think of you as a go-to source, you need to become a reliable asset to that reporter. Be as responsive and responsible as you can, and that positive relationship will build over time.